Hey everybody, this video is called Why Security for the Wicked? And tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Job, where we're going to be looking at Job expressing how it seems that the wicked have security in this world. And we're going to see Job's going to make a list of all kinds of severe sins which go on in the world. And Job feels as if God does nothing to do anything to stop them. And the sins that Job will speak of will consist of oppressing the widows and the orphans and the poor. And Job's going to focus on other major things like murder and theft and adultery. And all of these are forbidden in other parts of God's law and the Mosaic law in the Old Testament. And we're going to see that Job had a hatred toward wickedness. So when his friends accused him of being wicked, Job is coming out saying, hey, I'm with you guys on that. I can't stand wickedness. And what we're going to see here is that Job hasn't learned that justice in this world operates according to the will of God. And we're going to look at Job chapter 24, verse 1 through 8, starting out. It says here, "Since times are not hidden from the Almighty, why do those who know him see not his days? Some remove landmarks. They seize flocks violently and feed on them. They drive away the donkey of the fatherless. They take the widow's ox as a pledge. They push the needy off the road. All the poor of the land are forced to hide. Indeed, like wild donkeys in the desert, they go out to their work, searching for food. The wilderness yields food for them and for their children. They gather their fodder in the field and glean in the vineyard of the wicked. They spend the night naked without clothing and have no covering in the cold. They are wet with the showers of the mountains and huddle around the rock for want of shelter." So Job believed that God had knew all the appointed times for all activities under the sun, just like we're going to see later closer to spring when we go through the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And that will be late February, March, Lord willing. And Job, he mourned the fact that it seems that God didn't inform man about them. And the removal of landmarks in verse 2, it was an ancient practice addressed back in Deuteronomy 19:14, as well in the book of Proverbs chapter 22 verse 28 and Proverbs 23 verse 10. And corrupt landowners, they often did this to increase their assets, their holdings, particularly where the land was owned by bereaved widows. So they took advantage of the less fortunate of society. And taking advantage of widows will be treated by the ultimate court in heaven. And what it came down to is like what we see still today, because, history repeats itself. We see the act of greed and cruelty of these people. And the rich can be some of the most greedy and cruel people out there. And what Eliphaz labeled Job back in chapter 22, we see that Job agreed that this is how the wicked people act. Wicked people will not love their neighbors as themselves. And Job's doing this without agreeing on their accusation against himself acting the same way. And in verse 7, the night means it was common practice to take out a garment as a pledge for money owed. But in Old Testament law forbade keeping the garment at night, since its owner could get cold and sick. In verse 9 through 12, it says, "Some snatch the fatherless from the breast and take a pledge from the poor. They cause the poor to go naked without clothing, and they take away the sheaves from the hungry. They press out oil within their walls and tread wine presses, yet suffer thirst. The dying groan in the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out, but God does not charge them with wrong." So Job here in verses 9 through 12 is given a vivid description as he describes the heartless oppression inflicted upon the poor by the godless. And Job knew how wicked they were. What he couldn't understand was, why didn't God judge them and strike them down right then and there immediately, as they deserved? And oftentimes we look around us. We see the active shootings taking place every day and the violent crimes. We see all sorts of things happening. In verse 12, I want to reread it. It says, the dying groan in the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out. Yet God does not charge them with wrong. So Job makes a stinging accusation that human courts prosecuted offenders for most of these social crimes in Job. And in essence was saying, if human courts punish the wicked, then why doesn't God? In verse 13 through 17 says, there are those who rebel against the light. They do not know its ways or abide in its paths. The murderer rises with the light, and he kills the poor and needy. And in the night he is like a thief. The eye of the adulterer waits for twilight, saying, no eye will see me, and he disguises his face. In the dark they break into houses which they mark for themselves in the daytime. They do not know the light, for the morning is the same to them as the shadow of death. And if someone recognizes them, they are in the terrors of the shadow of death. So Job, he focuses on the misconduct of the wicked, singling out murder, adultery, and theft. And he gives powerful poetic images of sin that happen under the cover of darkness. And one should regard morning as something good, the coming of light after the dark night. And I know for people like me, I'm not a big fan of mornings. So, but that's what the scriptures say, that, morning is supposed to be looked at as a good thing because nighttime goes away and higher crime and more evil things happen at night because people go concealed. And the wicked people saw morning as the same as the shadow of death. In verse 18 through 21, it says, they should be swift on the face of the waters. Their portion should be cursed in the earth, so that no one would turn into the way of their vineyards. As drought and heat consume the snow waters, so the grave consumes those who have sinned. The womb should forget him. The worm should feed sweetly on him. He should be remembered no more, and wickedness should be broken like a tree. For he preys on the barren who do not bear, but does no good for the widow. So again, Job referred to the opinions of his counselors, saying that if their view was correct, all the wicked should be experiencing judgment immediately. But it's obviously they weren't. And Job believed that the wicked should see punishment begin in this life and continue afterwards. So in a way, he kind of agreed with his friends that, wickedness needs to be dealt with swiftly. In verse 22 through 25, to finish the chapter, it says, but God draws the mighty away with his power. He rises up, but no man is sure of life. He gives them security, and they rely on it. Yet his eyes are on their ways. They are exalted for a little while. Then they are gone. They are brought low. They are taken out of the way like all others. They dry out like the heads of grain. Now, if it is not so, who will prove me a liar and make my speech worth nothing? So Job's view was that their punishment would come eventually, and retribution needed the timing of God's wisdom, which determined wrongs would be made right. And Job was totally confident that his point could not be refuted. And in these verses, Job sounds almost like Asaph in Psalm 73, who was troubled in the prosperity of the wicked until he went to the house of God and understood their end. And Job reminded himself that God was not blind to the sins of the wicked. And even if they did not seem to face their consequences, even if they seem to prosper well enough in this life, soon they're going to be gone and brought low. So to wrap up today's chapter, we look tonight at Job explaining the conduct of the wicked. And in verses 9 through 12, Job says that the wicked oppress those who are the most vulnerable, those who are weak. In verse 13 through 17, Job talks of the deeds done in darkness. And Job's instruction reminds me of the Apostle Paul's words in Romans 13. And I want to swing over there. Romans 13. Verse 12 through 14 says, "The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore let us cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts." So we must put on the Lord Jesus Christ in order to be light. And in verses 18 through 21 in Job, it says that what should happen to the wicked. And the chapter, it ends with the seeming security of the wicked. And as I mentioned, we might relate to the chapter 24. And sometimes we feel like the wicked get away with a whole lot, and that there's, no light in the end of their tunnel. But, God's going to punish the wicked, maybe not on this earth, but for all eternity. So that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next for Topical Saturday tomorrow. So we'll be doing our first Topical Saturday of 2024. So we'll see you back tomorrow. God bless.